Good day. My name is Samuel Bro. I'm a program manager on the Prevention and Promotion team at the Mental Health Commission of Canada. I'm very happy to be hosting this webinar with you today. And just before we get started, I would like to go through a few housekeeping items. Please note that for the most part, audio is provided in broadcast mode via your computer speakers. Now you will hear a few beeps during the beginning of the webinar as some folks may have called in through your phone. For those that have called directly via phone, please ensure that your line is on mute to avoid any background noises during the presentation. And again, for those listening via computer, please note that it is provided via computer speakers. Secondly, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Mental Health Commission's website in the webinar archive section in the next 2 to 3 weeks. Third, if you would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download it right now using the Download Webinar Slides pod located in the center right of your screen. There you can select the item you wish to download and click Download File. I also invite you to send any questions using the Q&A pod, which can be found on the bottom right of your screen. Questions posted in this pod will go directly to the host. We will hold most questions until the end of the webinar and address as many as we can during the question and answer period. And also, given today's topic, I would invite you to make sure that you have someone to reach out to or to call in case any of the topics today generate any emotions or leave you disrupted, and also be able to identify a support in case that is needed. Again, for those that are joining via the phone, please ensure that you are putting yourselves on mute for the duration of the presentation. So on the topic of the topic of today's discussion will cross various topic areas, but will mainly focus on language. And I just wanted to spend a few moments to share some highlights of some of the work that we're doing around suicide prevention and awareness. What we do know is that suicide, of course, is preventable and that there are many organizations who are implementing innovative programs that are offering people support and awareness and decreasing suicides and working towards recovery-oriented practices. As such, this webinar series is intended to cross life promotion, determinants of health, blending suicide prevention, postvention, and interventions in Canada. We also know that showing care and spreading hope to someone who may be vulnerable to suicide is an important step in making a difference in their lives. And that's why in October, we launched a year-round online campaign to help spread hope. The content and impact of the campaign is being built by the general public. That means that it is their words, their images, and their messages of hope. This platform is hosted on the Mental Health Commission's website, and it helps create a safe space to share inspiring and hopeful messages. Using your social media platform of choice, whether Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and maybe there's new ones that I don't know yet, all you have to do is use the hashtag #ShareHope for English content and hashtag Partager Espoir pour le contenu en français. We'd like to take a few moments today for you to share your messages. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. We have with us Jody Golden, who currently works as a Senior Policy Analyst in the Suicide Prevention Unit of the Public Health Agency of Canada. Jody has extensive experience working in the areas of criminal justice, social services, and immigration. She's taught curriculum at the college and university levels related to social work, psychology, and gender studies. Much of her passion about mental health and related issues stem from personal and professional experiences, including work as a former executive director of the Elizabeth Fry Society of Ottawa and the JF Norwood Health. Her education background includes a Bachelor of Social Sciences, Masters of Arts in Criminology, and Jody's role of parent to an active and creative youngster is her greatest life lesson and passion. We also have with us Dr. Gigiane Varanka, an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Windsor. Drawing on disability studies, Dr. Varanka explores the consequences of mental health service, user inclusion strategies, and research and service delivery systems. Dr. Varanka is an adjunct professor at Ryerson University School of Disability Studies, an assistant clinical professor at Yale University's Department of Psychiatry. She's also a consulting editor for Aphilia, a journal of women in social work, and is currently completing a book manuscript on disability inclusion practices for the University of Toronto Press. And so I will pass it on to our speakers to share today's presentation.
Thanks, Samuel.
Oh, thank you. It's Jody Golden. I was actually on mute.
Thanks, Jody.
Thank you. So I'm pleased to be with all of you this afternoon to speak a little bit about safe messaging around the subject of suicide. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that is, why it's important, who it's for, and when and how we can all use it. I think I'll start with just talking about what safe messaging means. And again, for my section of the presentation, I'm primarily speaking about the topic of suicide. So safe messaging is a practice to ensure that communication about suicide avoids any language or content or images that could be stigmatizing or have any unintended or harmful impacts. We know from international research that there's links between media reporting with higher rates of suicide, subsequent, suicides, particularly among youth, which is called contagion. The higher rates or subsequent suicides are really related to the frequency and prevalence of suicide coverage in media, but also the severity of language and details that are used in public communication around suicide. We know that suicide is a public health issue. We know in Canada it's a tragedy that affects many of us, so it matters how we communicate about it. It impacts, our communication around suicide impacts individuals, families, and communities as a whole, and especially people impacted by suicide. We are interested at the Public Health Agency of Canada of having safe messaging move beyond media and also include careful precautions around the way we communicate, not just in mainstream and social media, but across all sectors in our communication about suicide. And so from the Public Health Agency perspective, we're leading by example in small but meaningful ways. And our number one priority is that suicide is conveyed as a public health matter. I just want to check that everyone can hear me through the series of beeps.
Hi, Jody.
Hi.
I don't want to interrupt, but I did want to acknowledge the disruption that the beeps cause and apologize to both you, Jody, and Dr. Varanka, as well as participants. We're trying to mitigate the issue, but thank you for your patience.
Perfect. So the Public Health Agency of Canada has the privilege, but also the challenge and responsibility of addressing issues that affect all of us. And we started work around suicide prevention with legislation that mandated us to develop a federal framework for suicide prevention. It was through that work that we learned that what and how we communicate about suicide matters and that it impacts people. It helps shape people's knowledge and attitudes and actions. We worked with many partners and people with lived experience, and it led to a greater understanding that we needed to be very mindful of our communication because it could actually be helpful or harmful. We learned that even some of the most commonly used terms and phrases could actually be contributing to stigma and counter our efforts to raise awareness, that they are actually maybe contributing to shame, silence, and stigma. So we started to look at how we communicate from a public health perspective. How do we frame suicide? How do we educate about it? And what's our message and its impact to people? So we actually realized that some of our own language needed to be updated to be more reflective of our public health objectives and to speak about our well-being and issues like suicide in a way that we speak about other health matters that affect us, but also, I would add, with extra care and compassion. So as you see on the slide here, we are leading by example. We are trying to promote safe messaging in all of our communication. We are coordinating and collaborating for change. This webinar is an example of that kind of collaboration. And we're also developing a suite of resources that includes a federal guide and a talking toolkit that will be eventually published for the fall. The federal guide will provide recommendations for federal agencies and departments on how to communicate and report on suicide. And I need to also acknowledge that this work and our activities is very informed by diverse perspectives, including people with lived experiences. So I mentioned that we started with principles. I just want to bring your attention to this visual that we've created. We know that there's a lot of silence, shame, and stigma and hurt around the subject of suicide. Our safe messaging approach is really geared to having a different kind of narrative around suicide that's more helpful, that's more respectful of the dignity and worth of people, and that is more focused on prevention and healing. And that's across the suicide continuum, from prevention, intervention, and postvention. So I just mentioned that language, and this is our focus today. Language about suicide matters. We know it's a powerful tool for shaping people's understanding, attitudes, and actions. And experts actually say that the action against stigma starts with choosing the right words. So we have to look at the kind of words that impact people. So, and one of the things that we've learned is many of the commonly used terms and phrases around suicide are actually outdated and inappropriate. The person who dies by suicide is not committing a crime or a sin. In fact, in Canada, suicide was decriminalized in 1970. So just as social and legal perspectives have changed, our language needs to be modified to reflect that. Suicide is typically the result or response of wanting to end unbearable physical or psychological pain. So to portray suicide as a crime stigmatizes people who experience thoughts of suicide or behaviors of suicide. And so we need to be more compassionate. We now live in a time when we seek to understand people, context, risk, and protective factors. When we say something is committed, it sort of is a bit of a judgment. So instead, the preferred language is died by suicide because it avoids that judgmental connotation. So think the next term of completed or successful suicide. Think of the sense of accomplishing something like a big project. Think about that, the sense of achievement or the disappointment you had. So completion is not the right word around suicide either. It conveys success or something incomplete. And we're just trying to simplify the language too. So rather, on the left side, rather than committed, completed, or successful, we now say died by suicide. Instead of failed suicide or incomplete suicide or failed attempt or unsuccessful attempt, the more appropriate stigma-reducing language is just to refer to suicide attempt or attempted suicide. And so why does this matter? Well, it matters in terms of the fact that the Public Health Agency of Canada has worked with the Department of Justice and Health Canada to make amendments in the Criminal Code, Section 241 actually, around wording around suicide and medical assistance in dying. So we've been able to remove the stigmatizing language that says committed to actually refer to die by suicide. So there's a standard set there that we can follow suit. The Public Health Agency of Canada has also been working with colleagues and coroners on the issue of opioid use and definitions around accidental or intended death by poisoning, where the definitions used to say things like death is believed to be, suspected to be by suicide. And we were able to, through collaboration and long discussions, be able to change the language to believed to be or determined to be rather than suspected. Language will evolve and there'll be no one-size-fits-all approach, but safe messaging is about encouraging people to take pause and check our language and the meaning of our message. So this side is just basically about some commonly agreed terms that are current now. I also want to talk about the language around people. So we know that across the suicide discourse, the way we refer to people is very different than in terms of there's different ways that people refer to people from a research perspective, a clinical perspective, or a medical perspective, or even from a personal perspective. And there's a lot of different debates around how do people identify with the kind of language. So this point is just really to be about the best practice in safe messaging is really to know who you're talking about and ask how people wish to be referred to. I'm going to talk a little bit about, if you see the sticker, I'm a survivor. Survivor terminology plays a big role in suicide discourse. In other areas, survivor can be potentially empowering and a self-identifier, or can help people feel connected to a certain experience. Survivors of suicide loss is a phrase that's commonly used to refer to family or significant others who are survived by someone who died by suicide. But we have also learned that not everybody embraces that term, and some feel that that's actually a label that can confine or define them. We've also learned through work with the Mental Health Commission of Canada developing toolkits to support people impacted by suicide, that those who have lived through suicide attempt prefer to speak to themselves about being a survivor as well. So survivor terminology is an important consideration when we speak about people affected by suicide. But if you look at the other pictures that are on the slide too, sometimes our language are pretty much labeling people. And safe messaging is really about trying to remove those labels, because labels are a form of discrimination. So safe messaging and reporting on suicide actually encourage what's called or known as people first language. And people first language is not a new concept. It actually came out of some of the work in the disability community and movement. And it's just a simple best practice that literally puts people first, before any medical diagnosis or disability or ability, before any characteristic or condition or behavior that might define them, before any other descriptors that might be discriminatory or stigmatizing, stereotyping, or even hurtful. It's about choosing our words wisely. And sometimes it might take more words, but it could mean a real difference. It helps us safeguard our communication and emphasize people's worth and dignity first. So I just want to outline that some of the work that we're doing, you know, from a public health perspective and a health perspective, sometimes there's a tendency to talk about people like subject matter or populations. We say populations at risk or vulnerable groups or those more susceptible to suicide. And these kinds of words and phrases actually literally can create a us and them connotation. And if we're really trying to educate that suicide affects all of us in some way, statistically many of us are touched by suicide in some way. If we really want to come back to the principles of safe messaging, hope, help, healing, prevention, then there's got to be a different way where we could be speaking about people impacted. So person first language encourages us to say things like, instead, person experiencing thoughts of suicide, someone who has experienced suicide attempt, people impacted by suicide. And that could be loss or impact. There's also impacted by caring for someone who may be impacted by suicide thoughts. And again, a person who's died by suicide. Some of the best practices around talking about, instead of populations at risk, we're now talking about priority populations or factual groups with higher rates of suicide and people affected by suicide. I included on this slide a couple of different examples just to show that this is not a new concept. It's a little bit new in terms of the suicide discourse. But if you look below, people who earn lower incomes is a more, I guess, it reframes language to a person-first perspective rather than labeling someone a low-income earner. And we know from work with the Royal Ottawa Hospital and the drug addiction, and then instead of using the word addict, it's more appropriate to say person living with addiction. I just want to provide the caveat here, though, that again, in terms of recovery and in terms of self-identifying, if someone chooses to use the word addict or recovering, that's their choice. This is more about, from a public health perspective, to be mindful and respectful that our communication impacts broad populations. And of course, considerations around age and culture and gender probably play a role here. So safe messaging is really about being neutral and inclusive and respectful. I just want to mention again that it's not a new concept. The Employment Services Department Canada also had a guide on employment equity. That's where the low-income earner language was changed. The Canadian Council on Social Determinants of Health have published a report around common messaging, again, highlighting the need for person-first language. And I just have an example. The photo below at the bottom of this slide is from my own personal experience. I participated in a weight management or weight loss program at the Ottawa Civic Hospital. And I came out of the room one day and I saw this image on the bulletin board. And I just happened to be really interested in it given the work at Public Health Agency. And it's really just an example of the label, I am obese. Or could we say, I have the disease of obesity. And even better than that, I am a person living with obesity. And I really liked the visual here, labeling or defining someone carrying a burden of something or actually addressing the fact that this is something some people live with. And I was very profoundly, personally impacted by this image and thought, I mean, these are the same principles we're trying to do around suicide as a public health issue. So I just leave that with you. It's just a bit of a personal example. And I'm watching the time, so I'm going to try to wrap and go through the next slides very quickly. In order to align our messaging, it's really important to consider the images that we include as well. So there is sometimes a tendency in mental health to choose images that show well, sometimes they're a bit, I would say, more negative or sort of against the principles of the hope, help, and healing. So a common image you will see is sort of the broken mind, a mind that's sort of falling apart. In terms of suicide prevention, we prefer some of the other images that are life-affirming or a sense of community and a sense of connectedness. So more focusing on the preventative factors that we know play a role in suicide prevention. So I like to say that our public communication around suicide requires 3 C's, care, consideration, and compassion. Because if our public communication around suicide is intended to promote positive mental health, then our message has to be helpful. If our intention is to raise awareness and prevent injury, illness, or death, then our messages have to be effective and focus on prevention, hope, and healing. And if our intention is to connect people to resources and community, then our message needs to be careful and considerate and compassionate. So care about everyone's different perspectives, and wherever possible, include information and resources of where people can reach out for help. It's about balancing sharing the facts about suicide without stigmatizing suicide or people. It's about safeguarding our messages. So we're not increasing risk, but we're also consulting with mental health professionals and others to make sure our messages are appropriate. And suicide, in terms of compassion, is about life and death. And so the voices and perspectives of people with lived experience are very valued in ensuring our communication is effective. I think that practicing the 3 C's can help ensure that we talk about suicide more openly and safely and responsibly. We're not new at this. There are some best practices, and I provide some resources at the end of this presentation. There are newly released 2017 media guidelines for reporting on suicide by the Canadian Psychiatric Association. There's also a tool called Mindset, which is really from the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma and CBC News. It was made possible by funding from the Mental Health Commission through a grant through Health Canada. Those resources at the end. I encourage everyone who communicates publicly or reports on suicide to have a look at those documents. They are good starting points in terms of safe messaging about this subject. And really quickly, some of us are in a very unique position to influence how we talk about mental health. And so this is just, I think it's got to go across sectors. I really challenge, I invite you to be a safe messenger and sort of nudge and take pause and see if we can reflect a public health message in our content. Promoting and practicing safe messaging will make a positive impact. It can support suicide prevention as long as we talk this way with each other and we message about suicide to the public, that we're mindful of our language, content, and images in all forms of our communication. I even think some of the most personal, medical, and official, academic communication could be safe message. I invite you to become a safe messenger. Thank you.
Thanks, Jody. Okay. So here I am, just to introduce myself. That was great, Jody. And just to remind those that are listening, I'm going to talk for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then 20 minutes at the most, so that we'll have some time at the end of the presentation to field some of your questions. So in my slides, I'm going to try to tell a little bit of a story that eventually will get us to the issue of language and identity when we're talking about people with lived experience in the context of mental health. So we're sort of switching from suicide language to mental health language. And I just want to preface, before I go on, I am an assistant professor. I teach disability studies in the School of Social Work at the University of Windsor. But I come to this position as someone with lived experience of mental health issues and homelessness. And so the work that I do is really based in that kind of experiential knowledge. So how I'm going to try to tell this story is first by talking a little bit about recovery-oriented care, and that language in itself can have multiple meanings. And as we know, one of the principles of recovery, one of the tenets is employment. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about bringing people with lived experiences into employment settings as peer workers, and then talk a little bit about how peer workers, when they're brought into those organizations, struggle with language and identity issues, and getting folks sort of more comfortable about talking with those that they're working alongside in recovery-oriented service delivery systems, to talk to peer workers about language and identity, because it's a really important thing to help people with lived experiences feel more comfortable. So that's how this is going to go.
Hi, Viviane. It's Sam here. Just wondering if it's possible for you at all to move a bit closer to the microphone.
Sure. Let me try
Thank
this.
you. Okay. Thanks.
Is this better?
Oh, that's fantastic.
Okay. Thank
Wonderful.
you, Samuel. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So here we go. So recovery-oriented models of care. I'm assuming that many of you are pretty familiar with the sort of recovery model approach to mental health. I just wanted to spend a couple of slides talking about how the language of recovery models is tricky as well and can have multiple meanings. And I always like to start when we're talking about recovery to anchor it in the recovery movement, which social movements are always very different than models. And this idea of recovery really started as a social movement in the 1980s that emerged because people with lived experience wanted to develop alternative self-help care models of care and services. So the recovery movement is defined by Patricia Deegan, who identified as a survivor and is really understood as one of the founders of this movement. really countered the notion that mental illness is a chronic lifelong disease and that once diagnosed, one can never recover. And so early recovery leaders in this movement, such as Deegan and William Anthony, argued that recovery is a deeply personal, unique process, and it's made possible through hope, willingness, and responsible action by the individual in distress in conjunction with recovery-oriented supports. This idea that people can manage or recover from the distress really emerged. So in the last few decades, as all of you probably know, a number of recovery models have developed, and most mental health service delivery systems now offer some form of recovery-oriented care. And there's a number of those models. There's the Ohio model, the Maine model, the PACE model, the TIDAL model, and a bunch more. And so each of those recovery models vary. They're a little different. And much of the work that Commission has been doing in the last decade or so is really around advancing recovery-oriented policy and practice. But still, what recovery-oriented care means in practice remains diverse, and there are a lot of different ways of doing the recovery model right. In 2004, a U.S. national expert panel suggested that mechanisms necessary for recovery-based practice must hold 10 fundamental recovery components, promoting qualities that include, and these are the list of 10, self-direction, individualized and person-centered approaches, empowerment, holistic, nonlinear, strengths-based, peer support, respect, responsibility, and hope. So based on those tenets, recovery models in practice include self and mutual care, social support programs and provisions, incorporating alternative and non-Western medical and cultural practice into treatment plans, peer support embedded in clinical and community care, and mental health organizations advocating for social determinants of health reform, training, education, and employment programs. So the language of recovery and how we use it is tricky and can mean a lot of different things. And I'm drawing here from work that, a book that Jennifer Poole wrote called Behind the Rhetoric, Mental Health Recovery in Ontario. And in this work, she really offers two different paradigms, ways of thinking about recovery. The first is recovery from, so this idea that people can basically reach cure from their mental health issues. And then there's the alternative, which is recovery in, which is really based on models of self-care, peer support, and living without the goal of this idea that one can return to normalcy, or that normalcy is the ultimate goal. So I think it's really important to think about when we're talking about recovery, what are we talking about? And oftentimes you'll find that there's a mix of both. For instance, some early Commission work in one of their first reports note that recovery does not necessarily mean cure, although it also acknowledges that cure is possible. And recovery principles, including hope, empowerment, self-determination, and responsibility, are to be harnessed by individuals, but must also be adapted to the realities of the different stages of life. So really in that quote from the Commission report, you can see that they're really referencing these notions that recovery from or recovery in can both be goals within this sort of idea of recovery model of care. So one of the things that is clear is that if you are going to offer recovery-oriented care, from those sort of lists of principles, 10 principles that are required, employment is one of the key factors for recovery. And having peer support workers on hand to offer support to folks who are in distress is also one of those principles. And so what this means now is that people with lived experience of mental health issues, but also all sorts of other things like suicide, like drug use, people who've been in corrections, all those folks usually denigrated experiences, that experience is actually now being acknowledged as a really important and valid knowledge base. And so these folks, peer workers, are being brought in to work within these systems that we're often affect us and we're managed by. And this kind of peer work labor is often, it sort of takes two forms. Either we're hired as community workers, peer support workers, for example, to work directly one-on-one with clients, or we can also be hired into mental health organizations to work as knowledge producers to inform policy and practice of those systems. So examples of that is like peer researchers or peer consultancies. And I have to say that in my experience, I've worked as a peer worker, as well as in my research, I find that the former, the one, this idea of hiring people to work with other people with various experiences of marginalization, is quite common, and the value that peer workers bring in that capacity is often recognized. But what is, I think we need to do a lot more work on is ensuring that people with lived experience are also recognized as important folks who hold knowledge that can help change policy practice and contribute to advocacy at a sort of systems level. So what this means is that people with lived experience are now being brought into these workplaces that have previously sort of run without us. And this is actually just an example from an infograph, I believe they're called, from the Canadian Housing First Toolkit. I worked as a consumer research consultant for the At-Home Chez Soi project, and much of my job was ensuring people's lived experience of homelessness and mental health issues were actively hired to work in that project. And the Canadian Housing First Toolkit, and the link is embedded in the references slide at the end of this slide if you want to go to that, has a lot of that toolkit, which is web-based and free for everyone, draws on a lot of experience from the work of the At-Home Chez Soi project. And so if you're interested in thinking about how to incorporate peers within your workplaces, you can go to that link, which is on the references slide. This is just an infographic. You got to invite peers in early. You got to, learning's a two-way street. You got to pay them, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing is that when you invite people with lived experience to work in your workplaces or to collaborate in whatever adventure that you might be getting up to around mental health, one of the things that you have to sort of recognize around language, the kind of language that you're using, as well as identity, is that if we're going to actually offer client-centered care or patient-centered care and recovery sort of frameworks for working with each other, is that everybody who has experienced mental health issues relates to those experiences in a bunch of different ways, right? And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the common language that people who've experienced the mental health system might use. So like Jody spoke a bit around person-first language, and so there's a lot of that comes, as she referenced, from the disability activism and advocacy that took place in the 1980s. And so some of the terminology you'll hear is person with lived experience, or person with mental health issues, or a person with psychiatric disabilities, or even some people might choose to say, I'm a person living with borderline personality disorder, or whatever that is. You have other folks who might choose to identify as a mental health consumer, or a psychiatric survivor, or an ex-patient, or just as disabled, a client. These are all fine languages for anyone to choose to self-identify as, because ultimately it's up to the person who experienced these things to come to some sort of decide for themselves how it is that they choose to identify, as well as the language that they're comfortable using when it comes to describing their lived experiences. So person-first language in disability communities and organizations is often very common, and so for instance, my students, who are largely psychology and social work students, have learned to say people living with a disability. And that's fine, and often my students want sort of the best, they want to know the one way, the one word that they can use that will make everybody happy. In disability studies, which is what I teach, a lot of scholars actually don't use person-first language, but there's been a move back to embracing the language of disability, and just folks in disability studies often write and use the language of disabled person. So there really isn't this like one rule will work for everybody. And I know that we all want to simplify language, but the reality is that people choose to self-identify and use particular kinds of language to talk about their experiences, and the best way to proceed is to actually honor the way that folks are choosing to identify, and you have to do that really by asking folks. So one thing that I can say is that sometimes people with this experience use language that can make other people uncomfortable. So for instance, if you have peer workers working in your organization and one of them's like, I don't actually identify as somebody who's living with a mental illness, but I choose to identify myself as an ex-patient, that might make everybody else in the room uncomfortable. But that's actually our uncomfort, that discomfort that we're experiencing is ours to manage. It's not about trying to get the person who has chosen to self-identify that way to change their language use. And certainly in the research that I've done, peer workers talk a lot about how it can be difficult for them to be working in institutions or organizations or all sorts of different settings where the go-to language of whatever it is, mental illness or disability or whatever it is, actually makes them, is very different than how they think about their own experiences or have made sense of their own experiences. So as we invite peer workers into our organizations and we embrace this sort of recovery model idea that that services should always have people who've experienced working within them, there's going to be some institutional and / community conflict, right? And that is good because that's how change is made, right? And so what I really just want to emphasize is that when issues of language and identity preference come up, if you're working alongside folks with disabilities, folks with lived experiences, whatever it is, it's actually, and these issues of language and identity come up, it's actually really crucial that you open up your space within organizations to have conversations with people with lived experience around language use. I'll give a really brief example. So when I was doing work for the At Home Chez Soi project, the Commission broadly uses the language of mental illness. A lot of organizations have to use language that, they use language for reasons of simplification and because of funding and this, that, and the other, all sorts of reasons. But the people with lived experience, we had an advisory panel and there was about 14 of us, and we had a conversation and we all identified differently. We had different experiences, mental health issues and homelessness. We had all sorts of, each individual identified differently, but we sort of collectively talked about how we were more we were, as a collective, comfortable with the language of mental health issues. So we didn't advocate for systems change, but what ended up happening was that when spokespeople from this large research project, as well as from the Commission, came into community settings, we noticed that they sort of switched their language to talk about mental health issues when they're talking in community settings, and that sort of, I think, made the people with lived experience who were working on the project feel like they'd been heard, and that they were contributing to these sorts of conversations around language in meaningful ways. I think ultimately and finally, and then I will stop talking and we'll have 15 minutes for questions, which is kind of perfect, is that it can be really difficult for people with lived experience to be brought into systems, mental health service delivery systems, or wherever else, research arenas, all that kind of stuff. And oftentimes that culture shock is only focused on those that are being brought in. But ideally, you actually, as a organizational culture, as a workplace culture, you should be feeling, the professionals should also be feeling culture shock. They should be feeling uncomfortable. There should be challenges. There should be tensions because it's through those sorts of dialogues that we can often find common ground. So that's it, and there's a list of references both from what I referenced in my little talk, and then also some resources that Jody has offered.
Thank you so much, Jody, and Zhijian, pardon me, Zhijian, and I was going to say, Jody, for your thorough presentations, and I feel like combined together, you've given a lot of ideas in terms of how people can concretely make changes both to language, but as well in how they operate, including how they can meaningfully engage and include people with lived experience in how they do business. We have questions that I think would be interesting to get your responses, both Zhijian and Jody. And I'm wondering, I guess maybe I'll start with the first one, which is, I think, Zhijian, you've kind of pushed us to realize that even if it's uncomfortable, it can be good. And I guess to build on that, I would invite comments from both of you in terms of how do you convince those that are still on the fence, those that feel like we can still continue doing the way we do business, that might say we've done it this way and it's always worked. How would you convince them? And I feel like you'll each have your perspectives, but I'm curious to get your comments on that.
Jody, do you want me to go first? Hello?
You might be on mute, so you can feel free to go ahead first.
Thanks, Samuel. I think that because, like, the problem with saying we've always done this in the past is that the past hasn't always done us justice as people with disabilities, as disabled people, right? So I think there's a long history of eugenics and institutionalization that shows us that saying that what we've done in the past is okay and that things don't need to change, relying on what we've done in the past means that we won't actually progress. And I think one of the delightful things about collaboration with professionals and people with lived experience is that I think we all know that what we've done in the past hasn't been working. And so if we can try other things for good measure, that it can only hopefully get better.
Jody, would you have any comments? Yes.
Absolutely. It takes my mute button a little longer than the virtual time. Apologies.
Technology, yeah.
Yeah. So I agree with those comments. And the other thing that I would add, especially working in the federal, the federal government, there is a tendency to use traditional language, the language that we're used to, use less words to say what we mean and things like that. And I think that this subject matter and public health issues, especially around mental health, has really opened our eyes a little bit more in terms of how we have to change. We have to help change that conversation. Social media is sort of a step ahead of us in certain ways. So how do we reflect that there's that change in conversation? And I know that colleagues of mine on the suicide prevention team and elsewhere, when we hear something like even on the radio or we see something in print like Globe and Mail, we've been very proactive in just sort of responding back and saying, hey, did you know that there's actually other language to use that's more current and more reflective and compassionate? So when I invite people to be safe messengers, it's that kind of response that we can have. And even in our work and in various different sectors, the way we communicate about the subject matter really makes a difference of whether we're creating opportunities for people to feel that they could reach out or provide support or get help. And I think it's really important. I'll give one more last example. We're still having rich discussions between different departments around, there's traditional language in the studies we do in publications. So one of the phrases is burden of suicide, and what we mean by that is the economic and social costs of suicide. So let's just say it that way, but change is slow, and we're headed in the right direction, and we need more of us to send along that message, I think.
Yeah, thank you both, and I think this has sparked a bit of interest from participants. One webinar participant shares, cars change with new technology, why shouldn't people? We come out with new technologies all the time, and I think with the spirit of kind of continuous improvement and being better. And I know, and thank you as well, Jody, for sharing about modeling, the opportunity to kind of provide, a different picture, a different way of doing things on social media. Folks are quick to write things. One participant was asking, how can we as professionals, either in mental health or public service or academia, like Zhijian, how can we be more active in promoting that cultural shift in how we message things? And I feel like you've shared some insights, but any other comments on that, Jody and Zhijian?
I can go first. It's Jody. Again, it's just, I think it is that modeling. It's just changing the language in print, written, verbal, like whatever it is that, however it is that you're communicating about the subject matter, be that resource that's making that shift and change. And when it comes back and people ask questions, then you back it up with, well, and there's other models in other countries that are far more advanced, especially around suicide, for example. You can look at the United States have a safe messaging framework, and Australia has Mindframe, which is media related but interested in looking at other sectors. So it really is grounded in other ways. So I think it's just to take that step forward and model that behavior and keep making those changes. When we say we need to address stigma, it starts with really how we communicate.
Mm.
Yeah, and I just add, I think one of the things that, because I'm largely teaching with students who are going to go and work in the health and social care community, that I try to incorporate as many readings and knowledge bases actually from people with lived experience across disabilities, so that so we engage the knowledge that's come from disability communities rather than from professionals. And that's actually a huge cultural shift for a lot of students and for us, when we're not relying just on sort of professional and academic documentation, but reports that come out from professional organizations, but also when we go to the source and honor the knowledge that's actually already been generated by people with lived experience, that often produces a pretty big cultural shift for folks.
Yeah, it's Jody again. I would agree, because one of the things that's sort of missing is that lived experience perspective, and some of the most rich discussions we have are at the research and academic level in terms of, the way we traditionally define something. There's other ways it's being defined.
Yeah.
This conversation could go on for for hours, I feel, and I just want to pay respect to those that continue to submit questions, and I apologize if we don't get to all of them, but I think we'll do our best. Jody and Gigiane, this builds on another question in terms of how do we ensure that people with lived experience have a seat at the table, and one participant who I know through other work, from where I sit, our perspective is that there's still a bit of fragmentation even in the advocacy community, and sometimes we hear about opportunities, but maybe after the fact. Are there any tips or suggestions in terms of how people with lived experience can ensure they have a seat at the table? And I know there's concepts like participatory research and other aspects, but looking for your comments and guidance on that.
So I'll take this first, Jody.
Yeah.
So I think as more opportunities grow, open up for people who've experienced to have a seat at the table and also to have some power at that table, then the more those opportunities will grow and grow and grow. And so in the last couple of years, where I've found myself is in university settings, which historically have been extraordinarily exclusionary of people with disabilities broadly, and this idea that people, specifically with psychiatric disabilities, shouldn't be in university settings. And so I think what I'm focused on is how do I make both I'm focused on my curriculum, but also my research methodologies. And so my research right now is using participatory action research, making sure that what I'm doing is actually what the communities, specifically people who've experienced homelessness and people living with mental health issues, what are their actual research agendas, and building some infrastructure within university settings to incorporate people with lived experience in those research agendas, let them have experience, and then that will grow, doing research, working on policy documents, and that will foster and grow more. And that was certainly my experience 20 years ago. I had a great group of folks who invited me in and didn't understand my experience as a deficit, but rather as an opportunity. And so it's really around mentoring that new generation, I think, is important.
And it's Jody again. I would just add that from a federal government perspective, here's an area where I think we still have some lessons to learn, and I think collaboration is the key. We're, I think, sometimes a little bit far removed from that lived experience, and so I know that it's one of the things that we have spoke a lot about in developing the framework for suicide prevention, that we really need to be inclusive of people with lived experience, and that is a valued level of input and inquiry.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, I'll go ahead.
Sorry, Samuel, I just want to add that intent is important, but it's also, we also have to think about funding, right? To make sure that people with lived experience are being paid appropriately as valuable employees, and so it actually requires us to do some budget shifting in all of our workplaces to make sure that people are properly honored and compensated for their labor.
That's an important reminder about recognizing the value and building on some of your work to create, actually defined roles in how people are contributing on those projects. So I hate to cut the conversation short, but I want to respect our collective commitment to spending an hour together ending at 2 p.m. Eastern. I first want to thank you both, Dr. Veronica, Gigiane, and Jody, for sharing your knowledge, experience, and wisdom with us. I also want to thank the participants for joining us from across the country, where we're over 500 participants together at the height of the webinar. So we do hope that you enjoyed the presentation, and at the end, either leaving the room or shortly after, you'll have a pop-up or an email that will invite you to share your feedback with us, including any ideas or suggestions for future webinars. And on behalf of us at the Mental Health Commission of Canada, we thank you again, Jody and Zhijian. We wish you a great day and look forward to reconnecting at our future webinar. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
All right, cheers.